Right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And a very warm welcome to all of you joining us from across the world. We have many people registered for this first webinar in the webinar series on international biodiversity law post-2020. My name is Harro van Asselt, and I'm a professor of climate change law and policy with the University of Eastern Finland, and I'll be your moderator today. This webinar series is being organized as part of an annual course on multilateral environmental agreements, which is jointly organized by the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, and the University of Eastern Finland, UEF Law School, in collaboration with the Government of Finland. With biodiversity declining at unprecedented rates, there's a clear and urgent need for a stronger global response to the biodiversity crisis. To help curb biodiversity loss and ensure that we are indeed moving towards a world that is truly living in harmony with nature by the middle of the century, the upcoming COP15 of the CBD in Kunming, China, is expected to launch a new post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Now, due to the ongoing challenges caused by COVID-19, the COP is being split in two parts, with part one taking place largely online next month and part two taking place in person in Kunming in the next spring. Now, although the pandemic has, of course, complicated the preparations for the COP, the stakes and hopes are very high for the global biodiversity framework to lead to greater ambition for countries to tackle the underlying drives of biodiversity loss. Against this background, and this is all I will say about the background, it is truly a great honor to have probably the two best possible speakers on this topic of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework with us today. The first one being Elizabeth Mrema, who is the Executive Secretary of the CBD. And the other speaker is Basile Van Havre, who is one of the two co-chairs of the open-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which just finished the first part of its third meeting online last week. Now, before we turn to our distinguished speakers, I first want to give the floor to our hosts from the UNEP, UEF, and the Finnish government to provide some welcoming remarks. And we'll start with Tita Korvenoja, who is the Chief of the Environmental Governance and Conventions branch of the Law Division at UNEP. So Tita, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Harro, and thank you, dear participants, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are. It is my pleasure and a true privilege to welcome you to the 17th edition of the University of Eastern Finland UN Environment Programme course on multilateral environmental agreements. UNEP is pleased to be part of this long-standing and successful initiative of transferring knowledge and experience in the field of international environmental law to current and future negotiators of multilateral environmental agreements, the MEAs. We are proud of our excellent cooperation with the University of Eastern Finland and the Government of Finland. I want to thank all of those in UEF, the Finnish Ministries for Foreign Affairs and the Environment, secretariats of the MEAs, and the colleagues in UNEP who have all contributed to the organization of this year's course. The course is taking place at a time where humanity is witnessing a watershed moment in dealing with the intellect threats of pollution, climate change, and loss of biodiversity. The science tells us that there is no time to wait. An estimated 1 million species are under threat of extinction, and over 80% of the biodiversity decline is caused by habitat destruction and land degradation. While the COVID-19 pandemic is keeping the world at its grips, it has also demonstrated how important the conservation of biodiversity is to the planet and human health. The theme of this year's course, the Post-2020 Biodiversity Agenda, is timely and important as the parties to the Conventions of Biological Diversity, CBD, are presently negotiating a new global biodiversity framework that takes into account the long-term strategies and targets, including the other key global MEAs. The goals and targets of the new framework are broad in scope, and the implementation work will require urgent and transformative action by governments and all of society. It is not an exaggeration to say that the outcome of the negotiations on the new biodiversity framework will constitute an important element in determining our path to a sustainable and equitable future. As for UNEP, it is crucial that efforts to address the global biodiversity crisis are continuing, and for that reason it is important that this course takes place despite the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. This will be the first time that the course is held virtually, and we hope that by extending these webinar sessions to a wider audience, an increasing number of people around the world will participate in the discussions. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge all participants to take advantage of the presence of our eminent speakers by engaging fully throughout this and the coming webinars. This, I believe, will help foster rich and fruitful discussions with practical outcomes for the conservation of biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tita. And indeed, that last call I fully support, and hopefully we'll get an engaging discussion with lots of questions and comments from the audience. Next up, we have, and we're honored to have, Jan Wahlberg, who is the climate ambassador for the government of Finland, working with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Harro, and good Helsinki afternoon to everybody, wherever you are. It is an honor to participate in this launch of the 70th course on international environment law and diplomacy, organized jointly by the University of Eastern Finland and the United Nations Environment Programme and funded by my ministry. The timing of the course is very opportune, as the end of 2021 marks the occasion of COP15 of biodiversity in Kunming, China, and COP26 for climate in Glasgow. Me as a climate ambassador, I'm a lot more involved in COP26, but I think the interlinkages are imminent. I talk a lot with my colleagues, Mrema von Weissenberg, who is our chief negotiator for COP15, and more, I think that the climate world is finding the biodiversity world, and we are working very much hand in hand. There are challenges negotiating ahead, and lots of climate and environmental diplomacy needed in order to agree upon ambitious targets and actions to protect our planet and share peace and prosperity. In other words, to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. Climate change and environmental issues know no borders. International cooperation is needed to find solutions to them. To tackle the current global crises, the COVID pandemic, climate change, and biodiversity loss, we need a renewed focus on multilateralism. The multilateral environment agreements are at the heart of it. I am thrilled to see that your program consists of 10 very topical webinars, plus an intensive negotiations training. I wish all the participants an enjoyable and instructive course, hoping that it will lead to skillful negotiators and firm defenders of multilateralism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for these welcoming remarks, Jan. And then last but certainly not least, we have Professor Kati Kulovesi, who is a professor of international law at the University of Eastern Finland Law School with its Center for Climate Change, Energy and Environmental Law. Kati, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Harro. And a warm welcome to everyone also on behalf of the organizing University of Eastern Finland and its Center for Climate Change, Energy and Environmental Law. Our university is located in East Finland and close to the Koli National Park, which is pictured behind me, an area of great national and natural beauty and rich in biodiversity, highlighting the importance of the theme of this year's course. Our university has been organizing this course together with UNEP and with funding from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland and the Finnish Environment Ministry since 2004. And thus far, we have trained nearly 500 participants from almost 130 countries. And normally this course takes place every year, but last year was an exception. And this year, the 17th edition of this course launching today is also exceptional in the sense that the course is taking place for the first time virtually. And the advantage of that, of course, is that we are able to welcome a much larger number of participants. And it really gives me a great pleasure to see so many of you participating in this opening webinar today. We have split the course in two parts. So we have the series of webinars open for everyone and focusing on the theme of the the Post-2020 biodiversity framework. Then we have a second part where we give training on negotiating skills for around 35 participants, and of course a warm and special welcome to you. We will have many opportunities to get to know each other and interact during this autumn in the form of lectures and exercises. So I very much look forward to meeting you as well. We have today a very interesting opening lecture ahead of us, so I'm not going to take more time. I just feel tempted to mention that we have very distinguished speakers, and CPD Executive Secretary Elizabeth Mrema has actually a very long history with this cause. So she has played a very important role in its evolution, and she's led it for UNEP for many years. So it feels very nice to see Elizabeth here, and also very familiar to have her with us for the opening of the course. So with that, once again, a warm welcome to all participants, and I very much encourage you to join us also for the other webinars in this series, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion during this course and these seminars. So with that, back over to my colleague Harro van Asselt, who will be moderating this session.
All right. Thank you so much, Kati. And before I move on to introduce the speakers, let me just give you a short household remark. You will have seen that probably there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, as well as the chat box. We strongly encourage you to post your questions, your comments to the speakers, or maybe in general that you want to share with the remainder of the audience, in the Q&A box, and we'll try and go through as many questions and comments that we can in the available time. But just to know that you can start responding and start interacting with the Q&A box as soon as possible, as soon as Elizabeth will start talking soon. But just we strongly encourage you all to make use of that. Now, let's turn to our first speaker, and I'm indeed delighted that she can join us. And our first speaker is the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, Elizabeth Mrema. Now, as many of you will know, Elizabeth has a wealth of experience in international environmental negotiations, having worked not just at the CPD, but more generally in the United Systems for more than 2 decades. Before joining the CPD, she was a director of the law division at UNEP, and indeed in that function, it was our pleasure already to collaborate with her in the organization of this very course in past iterations. But also, in addition to UNEP, Elizabeth has been the executive secretary of the Convention on Migratory Species, so also linking to other biodiversity conventions in the past. And I would say, testifying to her very important work in the area of environmental law, she was just recently in May this year awarded the Nicholas Robinson Award for Excellence in Environmental Law by the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. Again, showing the breadth of experience, but also the recognition of that experience by many other people in this world. Again, we don't have any better person, I would say, to talk about this topic than you, Elizabeth. So a very warm welcome to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Harro. But allow me, before I begin to speak, to sincerely thank the government of Finland, the university, and all who have been involved with this cause. It is the 17th, but I will just say it is the 17th. Basically, for some of us who have been participating in a number of multilateral environmental agreement processes and negotiations, it is always gratifying to see how many negotiators you meet who have gone through this course. So clearly, the cause has its value, and we can already see its impact in international environmental processes. So thank you very much for the continued support through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, through the university, and because the cause is on multilateral environmental agreements, and being in one of those, for selfish reasons, I'm even more thankful that you have decided this year to select Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework as the theme of the cause. Indeed, very timely, as my co-chair Basile will demonstrate later. But then for me, taking it up from there, As the result, thank you very much for inviting me and to share my opening remarks to this exciting webinar series. As a fellow lawyer, and having been, as you have said, lectured in this course many times, I'm really pleased with the selection of this year's topic, which is indeed very timely. Why timely? Because we have clearly reached a mark or break moment, both for the planet and the people. And we urgently need to bend the curve on biodiversity loss and heal our broken relationship with nature. It is also timely because we're in the midst of negotiating the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which we hope parties will adopt at the second part of the 15th Conference of the Parties to be held in Kunming, China in May next year. I'm joined, as you have seen today, with one of our co-chairs of the working group who had been mandated and actually driving the entire world in developing the framework for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and that is Mr. Basile Van Havre, who will give you a detailed overview of the process, and therefore I will avoid to even attempt to touch anything on the process. But outline of what has to be done, that will be up to him. And to understand how we got to this point, this is where then I will come in. And I will take a few steps back and reflect with you. And now specifically speaking as the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. For those of you who may know or who may not know particularly, but I presume all of you by now know, especially if those prior assessment questions to the participants were still part of this year's program. Nonetheless, CBD, or Convention on Biological Diversity, is a legally binding treaty that was open for signature at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. At that time, world leaders recognized the need to develop a strategy that allowed us to meet our needs, and while ensuring we leave a healthy planet for the future generations. At the summit, many countries also signed up for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, and the three of them popular today known as the Rio Conventions. Going back to CBD, it has three main objectives. First, conservation of biological diversity. Two, sustainable use of its components. Three, and very important, fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the genetic resources. It has currently 196 parties, and therefore it enjoys a near universal participation. Of course, notable exceptions currently are only the United States and the Holy See. It is serviced by a secretariat based in Montreal, which assists parties and observers to organize and service the negotiations like the ones now going on post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, providing subject matter expertise and implementation guidance. The convention parties meets every year under its two subsidiary bodies, the subsidiary body on scientific, technical, and technological advice, and the subsidiary body on implementation. Every 2 years, the convention itself is the highest decision-making body. The conference of the parties meets every 2 years. But over time, since the convention was adopted, it has also further developed by successfully also developed and adopted by the parties 3 protocols. And these are one which is now implementing the 3rd objective of the convention, access and benefit sharing protocol, and the biosafety protocol, under which there is also a protocol on liability and redress. The programmatic work of the convention is based on a 10-year goal period. And the previous one is the strategic plan on biodiversity, which ran from 2011 to 2020. And that plan had also included 20 Aichi biodiversity targets. And I've said this plan ended last year, although of course we know implementation, particularly at national level, continues until when a new plan is adopted. And this now leads us to what is going on now, namely the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which will cover the period 2021 to 2030. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, much as I'm talking 2021, the framework is expected to be adopted next year. So when we talk of urgent action needed, it means also we will have less time to 2030 by the time it is adopted. So we all need to have that in our minds. So let us also not forget that in 2002, the convention parties agreed to achieve a significant reduction in the rate of biodiversity loss, both globally, regionally, and nationally. And by 2010, clearly that goal was not met. So back in October 2010, when the parties adopted the strategic plan, which I've mentioned, unfortunately, the state of global biodiversity was already deep in crisis. At that time, the third Global Biodiversity Outlook, the convention's flagship publication, which provides a summary of the status of biodiversity and the analysis of the steps being taken by the global community to ensure that biodiversity is conserved and used sustainably. It found a deep decline both in genus, species, and ecosystems biodiversity, significantly worsened through ever strong harmful drivers ranging from overexploitation of natural resources to habitat change and global warming and invasive alien species. So the strategic plan that was intended to solve some of these issues by putting us back on a path to living in harmony with nature by 2050 did not take us there. So to live in harmony with nature by 2050, under the plan, parties agreed to take effective and urgent actions to halt the biodiversity loss, to ensure resilient ecosystems by 2020. So the plan included 5 overarching strategic goals and 20 targets, popularly known as Aichi biodiversity targets, setting a flexible approach that allowed countries to consider their own priorities and needs, as well as set their own national and regional targets. And this is the plan which expired last year, as I had indicated. And then, unfortunately, the outcome has been grossly underwhelming. Not even one Aichi biodiversity target was fully achieved, although some progress on about only 6 targets was partially made or partially achieved. And where some progress had been made, clearly indicated when actions are taken, changes ought to happen. So we've seen positive changes in protected areas, which in fact, hopefully by the end of this month, will actually have reached the target. 17% terrestrial and probably minus 0.2% of the marine environment. But also progress was made in the recovery of fish stocks, indicating effective fisheries management can improve stocks. Alien invasive species, particularly in the islands, equally improve, and few others. But on the whole, natural habitats continue to disappear. Vast numbers of species remained threatened by extinction. and about 500 billion US dollars continued to be used in environmentally harmful government subsidies, which had not yet been eliminated. As noted by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the IPBS, in its latest assessment report in 2019, it says, while that extinction and what Tita has also referred, in fact, basically biodiversity has been degraded beyond human imagination, unprecedented in human history, and identified primary drivers of biodiversity loss, which include land and sea use change, pollution, climate change, invasive alien species, again, overexploitation of natural resources, but also secondary drivers or indirect drivers, which include population growth, infrastructure, governance, and the like. So in some areas, we have actually been moving away from the goals instead of making progress on them. So of course, at the CBD, we began asking ourselves, why haven't the Aichi targets been reached or underperformed so badly? Clearly, we are better off with them than without them, because clearly where actions have been taken, some progress has been made. And still, but the results are still far below the expectations. If we are to repeat the same thing over and over and expect different results without making any adjustments, then you should not be surprised by similar outcome. So what did we do? We resolved to learn from our experiences and lessons learned from the Aichi failures of Aichi targets. And one of those key lessons learned from the previous plan and the Aichi targets was that it had failed to engage all stakeholders. The main audience for its implementation were expected to be national governments. And we all know now, in fact, more than ever before, that global biodiversity crisis cannot be dealt by governments alone. We need effective engagement by business, financial sector, indigenous peoples and local communities, the youth, the women, you and me and us all. To take responsibility, to take action if we are to succeed to bend the curve of biodiversity loss. And in fact, there are many other also lessons we have learned, which I will not go into details unless we'll have time at question and answer session. So what did we have then? To bend the curve of biodiversity loss, we therefore envisage an inclusive and universal post-2020 global biodiversity framework, a framework for all, not only government, that speaks to all sectors, that speaks to the whole of government, that speaks to all members of society. The working group co-chairs have thus done an outstanding, splendid job in reaching out and consulting a wide range of groups and stakeholders. And I'm sure Basile can tell you in detail how many meetings, consultations, he and the other co-chair, Francis Ogwal, have been involved in, and the feedback and how that feedback has enriched the draft framework, which we will talk about and be taken on board. Because this time, we do not only want a framework to be implemented by everyone, but we also want to engage the widest possible range of stakeholders, not just in implementation, but in its development. Ultimately, its effective implementation will depend on their efforts alongside those of national governments. It will therefore be critical to mainstream biodiversity into public and private decision-making across whole of government, whole of society. Just to give you an example, I'm currently a co-chair or co-lead of the task force on nature-related financial disclosure, a global initiative which was just launched in June this year that helps financial institutions and companies to shift global financial flows away from negative biodiversity impacts and risks towards nature-positive outcomes. Another important lesson we've learned from the Aichi biodiversity targets concern the lack of means of implementation. Having ambitious goals is one thing, but without the means to take action required to bring the goals to life, then we are doomed to fail before even the implementation began. The 20 Aichi targets called for a substantial increase in finance. And while financial resources for biodiversity from the international flows actually doubled, but they were nowhere near sufficient to meet the needs. And of course, money is not everything anyway. So a host of non-financial means of implementation are also needed to provide, for instance, capacity building, technologies transfer, scientific cooperation. It is also important to make provisions for communication, for raising awareness, just as what we are doing now, so that people everywhere can identify themselves with the framework and understand why its implementation matters to them, to us, to me, and how then we can all contribute to it. I don't want to set the bar so high for Basile's presentation, but please still allow me to say that the current draft of the Post-2020 framework, hopefully, and I can confess, indeed addresses these needs, which were overlooked in the previous plan. The third crucial piece, which means from the old strategic plan, which no doubt contributed to its shortcomings, is that it lacked a suitable reporting and review mechanism. Not only were there significant data gaps, several of the Aichi targets also lacked indicators against which progress could be measured. So for the post-2020 framework, we envisage a robust and transparent monitoring and review mechanism to enhance transparency and accountability of the framework as a whole. Having learned from the Aichi biodiversity targets, these mechanisms and the indicators it relies on are being designed simultaneously as the framework is being developed. And so that all these pieces will be in place when the framework is adopted. Political momentum is equally running high, delighted, and preparations are progressing well, as Basile will tell us, despite the pandemic situation we are in and devastating loss of life it has caused, unfortunately. The CBD process has managed to adapt to the new modalities of working virtually, and with the delegates connecting live as we do from all over the world across different time zones. Trust me when I say this was no small feat. Fortunately, the world is starting to get attuned to our work and to the vital importance of biodiversity to our future well-being. In September last year, the United Nations General Assembly, under the leadership of the President of the General Assembly then, put biodiversity high on the General Assembly agenda by convening a UN summit on biodiversity. As if that was not enough, in January, President Macron of the government of France invited leaders virtually for a One Planet Summit. Over summer, we held 6 weeks of online meetings through 6 weeks with parties and stakeholders of the convention's 2 subsidiary bodies, which I mentioned earlier on. And the Post-2020 Working Group just finished its 2 weeks discussion meeting just last Friday, last week, where they were able to discuss the first formal draft of the framework. And as we speak now, IUCN is holding its World Conservation Congress, which again, Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is high up on its agenda. And in 2 weeks, the United Nations will host Food Systems Summit. So you can see momentum is high on all fronts, and biodiversity in all its facets is on everyone's mind as we head in our roadmap towards the Conference of the Parties 15, which will meet virtually in October next month, and substantively next year, February, May, where we hope the Post-2020 framework will be adopted. Aside from these summits, countries have also joined forces under the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People that is inspiring an ambitious and a science-driven post-2020 outcome. Again, under a global ocean alliance, and both the two aiming to place at least 30% of terrestrial and marine areas under protection by 2030. And let me not forget the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, where 88 countries plus the European Union have committed to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. We are also working with the Global Partnership for Business and Biodiversity and the Business for Nature Coalition, which unites over 900 companies calling on governments to adopt policies to reverse biodiversity loss this decade. We have come a long way. From Rio Summit 1992, we have learned that it is no longer possible to address biodiversity in isolation. We must tackle this issue hand in hand with climate crisis, land degradation, and healthy. So all environmental challenges need to be addressed together to bring about truly transformative changes, to heal our broken relationship with nature. To do this, we must build more effective bridges. So between the work under the Rio Conventions, climate change, desertification, biodiversity, and outside formal processes involving all actors of government from national to local, business, and society. In closing, I hope I've managed to give you in a snapshot the idea of the scale of the challenges we are facing and why we need to take urgent action to bend the curve on biodiversity loss. Scientists have told us black and white, this is the last decade we have. Build it or break it. Are we ready to perish with the planet, leaving our children, no children, and our grandchildren nothing to inherit? It's up to us. So I also hope I've conveyed some lessons that we have learned from the previous biodiversity target and how these have guided us in developing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And with this in mind, I hope it has become quite clear to you that this is not just a discussion for academicians or researchers or the parties and the stakeholders under the convention. Everyone must be included, including yourself listening to me. Without further ado, permit me now to pass this discussion to one of the co-chairs, Mr. Basile Van Havre, the co-chair of the post-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, who are leading us all to really ensure a truly universal, ambitious, transformative biodiversity framework for the next decade to take us to our long-term vision of living in harmony in 2050. And he will provide, even in more detail, what is in this draft framework and how the discussions in the last 2 weeks were and what were his take from that process, and where are we heading moving forward? Thank you very much. Basile?
If I may, Elizabeth, I'll first say a few things so that I can also properly introduce Basile.
Perfect.
But thank you so much for a very inspiring talk as always. You've set the stage, you provided important context on the ongoing discussions on the 2020, post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. You mentioned, you included a passing reference to Albert Einstein to make sure that we learn the lessons indeed from the Aichi targets. And you've launched a very clear call to action for all of us, not just the parties in Kunming, but also all other stakeholders, including ourselves. Then I will keep it very brief, and I'll just briefly introduce our next speaker, who is Basile Van Havre. And as Elizabeth already mentioned, Basile is playing a very important role in these ongoing talks on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, because together with Mr. Francis Ogwell, he is one of the co-chairs for the open-ended working group on the post-2020 framework. But beyond that, he is an incredibly experienced government official who's worked for over 2.5 decades for Environment Canada, where he's been working on a range of issues, but he's also importantly Canada's CBD focal point. Without further ado, Basile, the floor is all yours, and I think you can share your presentation directly with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harro, and good day to all of you. It's a pleasure to be with you. I will now share my screen. And Harro, can you tell me when you can see the title slide?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much, and it was great to listen to Elizabeth, and she set the scene very well for us to get into a little bit more detail. I think beyond the detail I'm going to give to you, what I want to tell you is I want to talk about the future we want and the future we desire and how good that future is. The challenge is not where we are going. I think we all want to go there. I can see the image of boreal forest behind Harro and behind the previous interveners, or the deciduous one I took a couple of days ago behind me. That's what we want. That's the future we want, and that's what we're all about. I'll talk about the details, but you will see also, Elizabeth mentioned that we're just out of a major meeting, and that presentation was prepared a little bit before the meeting. So I'll be adding probably a lot of substance from from what I heard and what I say that is not necessarily on the slide. So let's start from where it all starts. That's a slide that shows the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service Global Assessment and what they have found. And that's a driving point for us. That's where we start. We start from the science, we start from what they told us, and then basically focus on the box that is surrounded by a red line at the bottom. Those are the drivers of biodiversity loss, and you will see them reflected as we move through the process. Land and sea use change, unsustainable exploitation, climate change, pollution, invasive species. And you'll see that their featured or importance is different from one place to the other, but basically they're relatively all in the same order. There is also that notion of indirect drivers. So what is behind, what are the forces that are making those issues? And we'll talk about it. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. That's probably a reading you should have in your reading list for your course, but that's the basis for what we're trying to do. How we organize and how we do our work. Starting from CBD COP14 in Sharm el-Sheikh in 2018, seems to be a long time ago, the decision was made by the parties to have a new framework and basically to have that as a party-led process. There was a creation of an ad hoc temporary body that carried out the negotiation. That's the open-ended working group meeting that took place just a couple of weeks ago virtually. And there was the decision to nominate 2 co-chairs. That's Francis Ogwell from Uganda and myself. And our role was to lead and coordinate the negotiation, represent the parties, and we're supported by Elisabeth and her team, which are providing the bulk of the support. Mandate, again, they wanted something that is driven by parties, that is open-ended, and basically what are the mark of the success of what we're trying to do is obviously we need to deliver a final framework for negotiation, for final negotiation, COP15, but also beyond the word on the paper. Making sure that we're creating and maintaining a positive climate is very important. We want people to be able to work together. We would like to have a climate where people are trusting and are open to each other's ideas. That's going to be also very important. Guiding principles. The urgency of the need to change. You heard Elisabeth talking about the analysis and the diagnostic on the previous framework. This is our last chance to put the system back on track. And then basically we're now in the very last stretch and we need to set the scene up to 2050. So it's not just about what is going to take place in 2020 now to 2030, but it is also about what we're preparing for the next 2 cycles. So that's a big difference is that it is mainly about 10 years, but it is very much about the system up to 2050. Principles: party-led, participatory, inclusive, gender responsive, transformative, comprehensive, catalytic, visible, knowledge-based, transparent, efficient, result-oriented, and flexible. So those are points that we've kept in mind and we've been using and referring to that have been guiding us. Elisabeth talked about the fact this is a framework for all. And we're trying to set these frameworks as frameworks that can be used by not only governments, not only Ministry of the Environment, but all sector of governments and all sector of society. I realize that there is discussion about that among parties, and there is different views about how far that framework should go, but that notion that success is built on the participation of others is very important. Now, on the process, and you see that very, very long and complex process, and perhaps the message here is that when we've been working a lot since 2018, and we've done a lot, and actually, when you look at where we are in the colored part at the bottom, there is a sense of getting to the finish line and that the time is counted. And in fact, it is. I'll be meeting later today with the team, and we're planning that work plan between September and January with a focus on the rest. But it is not like we can forget about it for a week. I think all of us, each of the participants have that sentiment that there is a lot of work to be done still, yet there is a relatively limited time, which is a kind of an interesting consideration given the additional time that we got with the delay due to the COVID. However, the way we've worked has changed a lot. On the left here, you see a picture of my desk at the August 2019 meeting in Nairobi. You see my book, you see my computer, glass of water, phones, etc. And I took last week a picture of my desk with the same book, the same pen, a cup of coffee, but that's the way we work. I could not see people. If you see them, there are those very small vignettes here. So we've learned to work in a very different environment. Some tools I'm sure will be there to stay, but it's very hard to conduct discussion when you don't see people. You're missing all that part of intangible emotion, etc. It cannot only be text. Now, let's move to the subject of the draft. So Elisabeth has mentioned that in July 2012, after a lot of consultation, we've published draft 1. This was actually in a very bizarre way, we're naming things in international negotiations. It was actually the 3rd version of the draft. There was draft 0, updated draft 0. But draft 1 is the one that benefits from a lot of input and basically was a major evolution of the process. So let's go into it. First, there is what we call a theory of change, which is basically a way to show the logic of the change from a current state on the left in black, to the vision, living in harmony with nature, and how are we going to get to that? At the bottom, you see your classic timeline with in black what is today, in gray up to 2030, and in white from 2030 to 2050. So basically, we get this nice vision, which is a few words, but how do we measure that? How do we know that we're getting there? Is my opinion better than anybody else's opinion? Probably not. So we are offering to the parties the idea that the mission should be characterized in a number of goals, and those goals would be measurable, and those goals would be then stepped down to 2030 as milestones. So that's the kind of system that enables us to know whether we're making a difference or not. In order to reach those milestones, there is a number of actions, and that's in the gray box called mission. Reducing the threats, meeting people's needs, tools and solution, that is all done within the context of means of implementation, enabling condition, and responsibility and transparency. We're going to get into the details of all of those. So first, let's start with the goals and the milestone. You see them associated side by side. There was lots of discussion over the last 2 weeks about the language in those. So what you see there is the proposal that Francis and I put on the table, and what you don't see there is the many pages of comments we got from what people have said. The first one is quite complex and verbose, and it kind of is as an assemblage of various pieces. What you should notice into that is that we have proposed that there should be measurable aspect to this. You see increase in integrity of ecosystem and the area of 15%. You see the risk of extinction reduced by 10 and by a factor of 10 risk. So basically, I'm not going to go into each of those, but you get the idea that we're trying to associate with each of the aspects a numerical aspect. And then further, when you move to the milestone, you can see that those numerical aspects are stepped down to what we think could be achieved in 2030. Once again, those are a proposal. There was many discussion on what those numbers should be, and in fact, whether parties will want to have numbers or not. But you step down into goal B, associated with how people of nature is contributing to people. C, on how the access and benefit sharing coming from the utilization of genetic resources. And then D, about the resources. And I have a slide a little bit later that get into more details about how that language is fitting together. You will see that we work from many source points, one being the Paulson study on biodiversity finance, and also OECD study. So basically, if you go online and you go on the website, you will find the rationale and the source for all those data. Undoubtedly, there will be more science and more debate on the source, but we're looking forward to see that. Now let's move to the action on reducing the threats to biodiversity. I don't know into how much technical detail you want me to get through, but I'll try to stay a relatively high level to leave time for the dialogue. But if you look at the group of target 1, 2, and 3, they're all related to land and sea use change. Target 1 is around how you manage the overall landscape and that notion of land use planning. Target 2 is around restoration, and target 3 is around the conservation and protection of a certain portion of the land. Elisabeth has talked about the fact that we reached the targets of 17%. Now there is a significant number of parties that are proposing to change that target to 30%. Target 4 is a bit of a catch-all target, which is catching all the conservation actions for species that are not covered elsewhere. That's a request that came to us from the parties. 5 is around that overexploitation, harvest, trade, and use of species. 6 is around invasive alien species, and we all know that's an area that is increasing in importance very much so. 7 is around pollution, and there we are proposing to use the three top substances as identified by the IPBES, which are nutrients, pesticides, and plastic discharge. There is a quite significant discussion on that, both in terms of the list of targets and in terms of the level. You can imagine that if you look at target 1, 2, and 3 about land use, if you look at target 7 on nutrients, and you translate that and see that from the eyes of the agriculture and agri-food system, those are major change. Add that to the change that are taking place under climate change. If you're not looking at the revolution of the agri-food production system, there is definitively a huge paradigm change. So I don't want to leave you with this impression of something negative about agriculture. Not at all. You're going to see further when we move on to the next slide that not only do we need agriculture, but we need a stronger and better agriculture. We need one that is working differently. We need one that is sustainable, no doubt. And that's based on what they will do and what consumer will do. So let's have a look at that. I'm sorry, before we move at that, I should have also mentioned target 8, which is around the relationship between climate change and biodiversity. And Elisabeth have talked about the relationship and the interconnection, and that's how we try to characterize. So there is 2 aspects to that target. First, the aspect is minimizing the impact on climate change on biodiversity. We've seen that every day. You heard about the translocation of species, climate changing our forests, and the capacity of forests to adapt or not to a changing climate. So that's one part. The other part is what can nature do to help with climate change mitigation and adaptation? You've all heard the figures from 30 to 37%. That's what the scientific telling us, that between 30 and 37% of the mitigation efforts could be met by nature-based solution. We've suggested that this should be translated into a target of 10 gigaton of CO2 emission equivalents. That's based on the UNEP figures. Again, lots of discussion within the open-ended working group on this and how that should be characterized, and we're looking forward to work with parties to see what's the best option there. And then finally, a bit of a request and a shoot out to the Glasgow crowd is how about they put in their system some similar language about ensuring that adaptation efforts have no negative impact on biodiversity. So Glasgow, this is a call from biodiversity. We're looking forward to see what you can do for us. So now let's move on to the other part, which is how nature is ensuring people needs are met. And here you get the targets around the exploitation of species for food, medicine, livelihood, shelter, clothing, etc. We focus on the poorest communities, but 10 is around how we use our landscape, agriculture, aquaculture, forestry, and how we're making sure that those ecosystems at the same time are both meeting people needs, meeting the needs of an increasing population on our Earth. We'll be adding 500 million people in Africa in one region alone, but also do that in a resilient and sustainable way. How do we make sure that we can feed people today, but we can feed them tomorrow? 11 is a catch-all of all the other regulating service in terms of water protection, protection from hazard, etc. 12 on increased access and benefit sharing, sorry, that's 13. 12 is around the access of green and blue space for people, particularly a number of us that live in urban area. How can we ensure that there is this access? And then finally, a different category, which is around how those are the targets that are about enablers, the tools and the solution. How do we integrate biodiversity into our decision? And that's the first group, 14, 15, and 16, which is around what we call mainstreaming, which is the integration of biodiversity into the decision that are made. For 14, it's a focus on government at all level. including how national accounts are taking care of biodiversity, assessment of impact of environment at all levels, ensuring that activity and financial flows are aligned with biodiversity values. 15 is around business, all business, and focus both on their dependencies on biodiversity, but also their impact on biodiversity. And you see the language in 15, which is largely around the circular economy. 14 and 15 cannot go without 16, which is about the choice that each of us are making every day. Some of us have access to alternatives. It is not the case everywhere. Let's make sure that people have access to alternatives that are sustainable and have in hand the information and enable them to make sensible choice. The market is driving many of our systems, including the agri-food system that I was talking about earlier. 17 is around managing the adverse impact of biotechnology. The positive one are characterized in the series I presented before. 18 and 19 goes together. They're about finance. One is about redirecting, repurposing, and reform harmful subsidies. I think there is a large consensus around that. There is discussion on what is the end amount. The amount we've put here is derived from the OECD studies and feel that there is a reasonable ways to get to about 500 billion by the end of the decade. 19 is about the other side. So increasing available finance, bringing it up to 200 billion, of which an increase, within that increase, there will be at least a 10 billion increase in international financial flow to developing countries. So two important numbers. 20 is around the availability of knowledge, information, and data, both in terms of decision-making, education, and research. And 21, last but not least, definitively, is the targets around participation of all, in particular, indigenous people and local communities. And we've used there the language coming from the UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People. So to put all that into a summary, we have a bit of an animation starting with the center where you get the mission. That mission is materialized into 4 goals. Those goals are further translated into milestone at the 2030 level. Then there is a number of action targets from 1 to 13 that enable that to be done. Those are supported by 14 to 21 tools and solutions, but all that is done within the context of enabling conditions. So that's a very, very rapid presentation of the framework. Again, lots of discussion on the shape, but frankly, one thing that struck me is there was very wide-ranging support for the overall structure. A couple slides on top issues, and I'll go quick around that. The links between nature, climate, and health, and we heard that a lot. Often when you get down to action at the national level, there is no separate streams of project for nature and the separate one for climate. Often they're a single project. And what we get to build is a system that recognizes the multiple benefits of individual actions. We need to coordinate our process from the planning stage to the reporting and the review, both also how we operate, but also how we resource them. Increasing the momentum between 30% of the climate dollars going to nature-based solution. How do we harness the private sector finance? And then looking at those change, not from our perspective, my perspective, or Elizabeth's, which is biodiversity, but looking at it from the client perspective, from the system perspective. So what does all those change means for the agri-food sector, for the infrastructure sector, for extractive industries, and then come to them with integrated scenarios that enable them to work through that change. So definitively there is process in place, and what we call the burn process sponsored by Switzerland is a good way to engage at the MEA level. But beyond that, there is also coordination to be done with non-state actors. And then that notion that we have 3 crops over short periods, maybe not in 2021 solely, maybe up to 2022, but having cross language that goes from one to the other is very important. The agri-food system, Elizabeth talked about the agri-food summit, the food summit that is coming up. That's probably one of the challenge that I keep thinking about is how can we have a realistic change to biodiversity without a change to our agri-food system? I said earlier, this is the links between land use, pollution, people choice, mainstreaming. The drivers are both nature and climate. How are we engaging agriculture decision makers? Are the agriculture ministries present during a discussion? Are the agri-chemical producer and the farmer association? I think they're increasingly participating, but are they forefront and at the level where I would dream to see them? Perhaps not. So the food summit is there. The work of the World Economic Forum is also very important, and I'm optimistic we're going to get there. Another issue is responsibility and transparency. Elizabeth has talked about that. Why do we want that? We want transparent communication, being able to tell people, is the framework making a difference? Are all those changes we're going to ask people to do going to be driving to the result we want? But also, we want to be able to adapt and change. No doubt that despite the great efforts of all of us, including people that are here on this call, there may be some things to change after a few years in the framework. So let's have the system enable us not to wait until the end of the 10 years, but adapt rapidly. And then also we need to be ready for the next GBF. So when we get to the end of 2020, we got to look beyond that. How we want to do that? We don't want to create more burden to people. Particularly, we heard that very clearly from developing countries, but all. We want to be aligned and integrated with all, and we want an open architecture that enable all the system to be built and attached to it. What it is, basically trying to represent the system on two dimensions: the function, planning, reporting, and reviews, and going from a national system to the global one. So national strategies will be the starting point, national commitments, all targets, there are relevant performance indicators, and then financing plan. So Elizabeth has talked about that a plan is just a plan. What is important is the change that the plans will create. And those changes are also dependent on the resource being there. Reporting, all actions in the plan using agreed on indicators. We got to be able to assemble all those reports at the global level, and they got to be done at a frequent pace. Roles of the global biodiversity outlook and of the best assessment. And then there is the review part. There is a number of tools available from open-ended forum, voluntary peer review, and the analysis of objective numerical data. The process, the GBF will have a certain level of high-level information, the principle, etc. But the details should be in that is relevant to the CBD are likely to be in the COP15 decision. And then we'll see after the COP where we go with the rest. Now let's talk a little bit about finance and where we are. So today, there is about 150 billion spent on biodiversity. Half of it, a little bit more, is coming from government budgets and taxation. And then you see the sprinkling of the rest with natural infrastructure being a notable one at 20%. So that gives you the starting point on where we are. So let's look at what we're proposing in the framework. So that vision for 2050 is that the financial gap is closed. So whatever we need in terms of money we have, and those are two different terms. The first one is on cost, and you see today that there is a very large gap between the needs or the cost and the resource available. The interim targets that we have is reducing that gap by 700 billion, and that is going to be done by increasing to 200 billion the resource available. Remember the last line, 140. So we're talking about $60 billion additional resource funding, of which 10 billion should be going to developing countries. But more importantly, decreasing the cost through mainly that decreasing of negative incentive and subsidies is the key tool. So that gives you an idea of how target 18 and 19 works with goal D. Very quick word on access and benefit sharing and digital sequence information. There has been a lot of work. This is a complex subject. I would say looking at digital sequence information, that the first and foremost is for all to agree on facts. We can all disagree on have different views on the way we need to deal with this, and that's quite natural. And we will work through our differences and find a solution. But the basic facts should be agreed to. There's been a number of formal and informal process involving the European Union, China, a number of Norway and Africa, and perhaps a couple works on where we are. There is a very big difference between what is happening between the source and the use of data, both from the number of digital sequence information that people have. Some people have that notion that you use one sequence information to derive one product. The reality is that you probably have thousands and thousands of products that are used, and then they're treated using complex algorithm processing the data. And also, it's not the direct sequencing information that is used. Often it's derivative of those sequencing information. So that's that problem, that issue about understanding the facts. And then the rapid increase in the number of sequencing information is really a factor to keep in mind. Next step, we will be continuing the dialogue both informally and formally, and we'll be moving into evaluating the cost and the feasibility options of the various policy options. I think we're on a good track to go to a solution. Now, some final thought on where we are. I am an optimistic by nature, and my sense is that we're on track to deliver something that is good. What struck me in the last 2 weeks is how we've been able to keep a constructive climate and goodwill. People were willing to talk to each other. Discussion has started, and we're starting now to know and understanding the issue of convergence and divergence, and we're in the process of building the plan. We have a significant amount of help and resources sitting outside of our office. NGOs, think tanks, the parties, etc. So I am confident that we can build a good plan, and we're going to be ready for taking on this formal negotiation when they will be starting in Kunming, in Geneva first, then in Kunming. So Harro, this completes my presentation. I'll stop sharing my screen and pass the floor back to you. Over to you.
Right. Thank you so much, Basile, for this excellent overview of draft 1 of the Global Biodiversity Framework document. Now, as a moderator, usually I prepare some questions in advance if we're in the back pocket, but clearly that is not necessary now, because we're being flooded not just with questions, but also with very highly relevant questions. So I want to dive straight in there, and my suggestion is that I try and group a number of the questions together, and then allow each of you to respond to those questions if you feel that you can. So I think the first group of questions that I saw that I tried to take together is about the relationship between the ongoing negotiations and the future GBF and other processes. And Elizabeth already mentioned a few of these processes in her talk, but we got some more concrete questions about some of these relationships. So I'll just summarize the questions that I saw. The first one is more generally, how do you see these relationships happening and emerging? Is there something in the document that you can see as trying to establish some kind of coordination between what's happening under the CBD and other multilateral environmental agreements? So that's the first sub-question. The second sub-question is specifically about the ongoing negotiations on biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdictions, where we have a simultaneous parallel process happening also under the UN. So how do you see the relationship with that? And the third one is specifically linked to the SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. So how do you see the CBD discussions, the post-2020 framework, linking to Agenda 2030? So I would say this, I take this as the first group of questions, and maybe Elizabeth, you want to start, and then Basile can see if he can add.
Thank you very much, Harro, and my sincere thanks to Basile. Myself, I keep learning every time I listen to him, just on that framework. So it shows how rich and complex it could be. With regards to the CBD processes or process and other MEAs, one, within the biodiversity MEAs, we have a group called biodiversity related MEAs. So where we meet, and the two processes, BEN 1, BEN 2, which Basile mentioned, actually brings together the biodiversity related conventions, MEAs, and the parties. And through those two workshops, actually also discussed where the meeting points are. It is our expectation, as the discussions have gone on, that once the framework is adopted, which has engaged not just CBD parties are also parties to the other biodiversity related, including chemical MEAs. So we are talking of the same parties. And when we talk of mainstreaming and synergies at national level, we hope the same is also happening. Each department talking to the other, different focal points talking to the other. So the expectation is once the framework is adopted, and so far I know the MEAs have been heavily engaged to make sure they see their MEAs in the draft framework, so that then they could be the channel of implementing those provisions through their own conventions and through aligning the framework with their own strategic plan. So that's what is expected for the future. And that, of course, continues. And our engagement with them continues, and Basile will confirm how much written comments he has received from the MEA Secretariat and the Secretariat through from the other MEAs parties through their secretariats, to really make sure they can see themselves. And of course, Basile, for instance, has mentioned issues of species, trade. This is where CITES sees itself. He has mentioned of issues of connectivity and conservation. This is where Convention on Migratory Species sees itself. He has mentioned about waste and pollution. That's where the chemical conventions see themselves. So we look forward actually to expand the implementation through the other MEAs. BBNJ, areas beyond national jurisdiction negotiations going on, and going on probably in parallel because of all the postponement. Also, the draft framework has targets on marine environment, and this is where we'll see as the meeting point. And of course, CBD Secretariat have been participating in the BBNJ negotiations, again for that purpose, to be able to keep on updating them on the developments on the CBD processes, and see how then those could also be considered as relevant in the BBNJ negotiations also going on. How the framework is linked, connected to SDGs goals. One, we should remember, 14 out of the 17 SDGs directly depend on contribution from biodiversity. In addition, I then say all 17 SDGs will also depend in one or the other on the contribution from biodiversity angle. So we should not look at only SDG 14 and say that is square biodiversity, because when you look at the framework, there are water issues, there are pollution issues, there is consumption and production issues, there are meeting human needs, those are poverty issues, there is stakeholder, women, gender issues. So you can see it's already built in. 1, 2, the targets are up to 2030. At the time when also SDGs will be reviewed. So we hope also the countries the parties, as they report, will not be reinventing the wheel, but is also creating that synergy as they implement SDG. They are simultaneously also actually implementing the framework, and the reporting then can be in tandem and complementing each other. In short, that's what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Basile, you want to add to that?
Thank you. A couple points on synergies. I think what we have is well-coordinated secretariat and the machinery inside the UN system being well on. Question that we're asking ourselves as parties: how are parties connected? We have some. I think what we discovered through the synergy process that Switzerland sponsored is that was perhaps the first time as parties we were talking about each other. So that's something we're going to need to think about. The second point are people issues. It's amazing how when you, it's not amazing, it's probably normal. You talk to people at the theoretical level, they're all willing to talk and they see the rationale for collaboration. But when you get into the last few days for preparing for a COP, all of a sudden, everybody become very, very focused and want to focus on delivering on their own thing. And then all of a sudden, the listening room for others become less so. So we got to be mindful of that, and we got to be mindful about challenge that some of the ideas could come. So the people aspect. On BBNJ, I would go a step further than Elizabeth. The CBD absolutely depend on a successful BBNJ negotiation. When it comes to objective on land and on sea conservation, we can implement those objectives within territorial sea and perhaps all the way to the edge of the EEZ through national jurisdiction. The equivalent is needed in high seas, and that's where the BBNJ is critical. There is very good collaboration. The party lead for the BBNJ is a colleague of mine that I've known for several years, and we've talked to each other regularly. So be reassured that this connection is well made. And then finally, on SDG, I forgot to mention that a companion document to the Global Biodiversity Framework is the monitoring framework. That's where the performance indicators are. And if you look into that, you will see that out of the top level indicators, which are called the headline indicators, there is 28 of them. More than half of those are SDGs. So we're not trying to reinvent. We're cutting and pasting as much as we can. Thank you. Back to you, Harro.
Thank you both. I'll summarize the next set of questions then, which I think all are directly or indirectly about online negotiations and inclusion. So there's a number of questions. So one is about the pros and cons that you've experienced so far with your online negotiations. So how has that experience been, and how might that inform future negotiations? Then the second question is, well, what does the fact that some of this is happening online mean for inclusion? How can we make sure that all stakeholders are involved in the development of the global biodiversity framework? And then a third, again, sub-question, going back to one of Elizabeth's point, is about momentum. How do you maintain momentum when we are not necessarily meeting in person all the time? So again, maybe I'll start with Elizabeth, and then Basile can follow up.
Thank you very much. Experience on the online negotiation has been surmountable, if I may use the word. It's becoming easier now as we move on, but at the beginning, of course, it was not easy because it was a new thing to all of us. But I should say we have faced major challenges, particularly for our participants in the process from developing countries related to connectivity of the technology or the virtual platforms, the internet connection, the bandwidth, and the like. One, the other major challenge has been the time zones. So always, if we meet in a global setting, it basically means if we begin at 6 in the morning in Montreal, then those in Australia and New Zealand, it's past midnight. Those in the Pacific is around 4 or 3. So that has also be a major challenge. But delighted that over time, parties have agreed, of course, reluctantly, to come on board, and we continue these meetings. Recently, which we have tested in the last meeting, the last 2 weeks meetings with the working group, was to help to support the countries that needed with increasing their bandwidth, or getting, is it the credit, the internet connection, or putting the national delegations in a hotel at one place, whereby then facilities could be provided, and that given them also an avenue to discuss with each other as they participate in the negotiations. So we did that for the last 2 weeks, and thankful to our UNDP colleagues who have helped us and made it happen now at different national level. Of course, where the difficulty is to be able to align the time zones globally, that they are all good time zones for all. That has been a difficult one. What the message we have continued to receive from our parties is that these negotiations cannot be complete without a face-to-face negotiation. So the online negotiations are not replacing the face-to-face, and we all know why. And that's why our 2 subsidiary bodies, which met for 6 weeks in May, June, as well as the last working group 2 weeks ago, they are all suspended. We did not finish. They are suspended to meet face-to-face in Geneva in January. Fingers crossed, all will be well to help us meet in person and advance those negotiations. So in terms of inclusiveness, that's how we have tested now the last 2 weeks meeting, because we did not only support the countries, but also indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as the youth groups.
Right, thank you.
With regards to maintaining momentum, what we are delighted with in terms of momentum and with the understanding or the trend we are seeing that this, the post-2020 is not only for governments, is the support we get from many stakeholders who are also organizing their own events to discuss the post-2020. And I'm sure Basile can tell us whether he has any day free without being asked to present the post-2020 framework or the process in different meetings, be it finance groups, be it the business groups, the youth groups, like the indigenous peoples and local communities. There were 4 more 3 thematic sessions, if I recall, before the working group last week. So this has helped us also to maintain momentum, not just at political level with high level, but also through the different stakeholders who have shown interest to learn more about the process. And what I even forgot to mention in my presentation in terms of momentum, during the working group the last 2 weeks on 30th August, we also had the president of Colombia organizing a high-level segment with heads of states and heads of UN entities and other bodies, again to underline the importance of biodiversity and taking action and giving us all the momentum for the discussions on the framework which were going on at the time. So we hope this will continue, and these discussions we are having now is part of that keeping momentum, because again, through you will help us to deliver the message. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Basile, I will give you the final word in response to these questions.
Thank you. A couple points to add to what Elizabeth has said. I think two things. We've been learning over the last year. So the response, I think we're much better than we were. Are we perfect? No. Do we need to do better in terms of carving a place for non-state actor? Yes. What I see in the future is that online process can enable reaching a much wider audience within the country. So I was talking with Francis the other day, and we were reflecting that our own national delegation are much larger in online meeting. So the delegate that would have traveled on his own, or maybe with a small team, does not need to go back home and do a debrief of the colleagues in forestry, in natural resource, because we can have them online and they're interested in being there. So we can reach wider. And we've established, I think, that the first part of the process, that is not the negotiation, that is the exchange of views, is perhaps well done on an online format. What we're struggling with is the formal negotiation, and that's why I think there is a commitment to do it online. So clearly, we're gonna need to build a system. And let's all keep in mind, we don't know what the future is going to be done. I think it would be foolish to think that by December all is going to be done. That situation of pandemic may be with us for several years in different forms. So that's not our choice. That's not something we want, but we have to work, and we got to make the best with the tools we have. And we will continue to learn as we go. Back to you.
Thank you, Basile. And I think the value of being online with a large community has proven itself also with this webinar. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of it, so we have run out of time. There have been so many great questions. I've at least making note of them, but unfortunately, we cannot ask Basile and Elizabeth all of these questions, but hopefully they'll form the basis for continued discussion. Just as some final remarks, first of all, thank you so much to Elizabeth and for Basile to sharing their valuable time with us today and sharing their experiences and their knowledge about the ongoing negotiations on the Global Biodiversity Framework, and also sharing their call for action for the coming months. But thank you also to all of you who we haven't seen here. That's all of the participants who've been coming up with excellent questions along the webinar, and thanks all again also to the co-hosts, so UEF, UNEP, and thanks to the government of Finland for sponsoring this all. Just as a reminder, you're very, very welcome to join us again on the 14th of September, which is already in 5 days, for the second lecture in this webinar series, which will be given by Professor Jonah Razak on the very provocative question of, is international biodiversity law fit for purpose? So we strongly recommend you register if you haven't done so yet, and join us again next week. So with that, I would like to thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye.